The cashier looked right through me like I was invisible, then turned to the white girl behind me and said, "Next." My heart stopped. In that moment, I realized that no matter how hard I studied, how politely I spoke, or how carefully I dressed, some people would only see the color of my skin. But what happened next would change everything I thought I knew about standing up for myself. Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below. My name is Maya, and I'm 17 years old. I live in a small town called Millbrook in Ohio, where my family moved when I was 12. We're one of only a handful of black families in our community, but I never let that define me. I was the type of kid who believed that if you worked hard enough, treated people with kindness, and stayed true to yourself, the world would treat you fairly in return. The move to Millbrook hadn't been easy for any of us. My parents, Dr. Angela Johnson and Dr. Marcus Johnson, were both college professors who had taken positions at the local state university. Mom taught African American literature, and Dad was a professor of environmental science. They had left behind a diverse community in Atlanta where I had grown up surrounded by kids who looked like me, where my natural hair was celebrated, and where being smart and ambitious was expected, not exceptional. I remember the day we drove into Millbrook for the first time. The moving truck ahead of us looked enormous against the backdrop of cornfields and white picket fences. "Look at those beautiful trees, Maya," my mother had said, trying to inject enthusiasm into her voice as we passed rows of colonial-style houses. "And the schools here have excellent academic ratings." But even at 12, I could read between the lines. I saw how my parents exchanged glances when we stopped at gas stations and restaurants during our house hunting trips. I noticed how real estate agents would suddenly become less available when we called to schedule showings. I watched my mother's smile become more strained each time someone asked where we were originally from, as if Ohio couldn't possibly be our home. The house we eventually bought was beautiful, a Victorian-style home with a wraparound porch and mature oak trees in the backyard. It was also the house that had been on the market the longest in the neighborhood, and I later learned that several other families had mysteriously withdrawn their offers when ours was accepted. Our first year in Millbrook was a masterclass in code switching and survival. My parents threw themselves into their work, earning respect through their academic credentials and expertise. Mom started a community book club that became wildly popular, and Dad initiated a town-wide recycling program that won state recognition. They were building bridges, creating connections, and proving their worth in a way that shouldn't have been necessary, but absolutely was. For me, middle school was a different kind of challenge. I was used to being one of many smart kids in my classes, but here I was, often the only black student in advanced courses. Teachers would look surprised when I scored highest on tests, as if my intelligence was somehow unexpected. Classmates would touch my hair without permission and ask invasive questions about my family's culture and background. I learned to navigate these microaggressions with the grace my parents had taught me. When kids asked if I was adopted because my parents were so educated, I would calmly explain that black people had always valued education, even when we were denied access to it. When teachers seemed shocked by my vocabulary or writing skills, I would simply continue to excel, letting my work speak for itself. By high school, I had found my rhythm. I was a straight A student, captain of the debate team, and volunteered at the local animal shelter every weekend. I played violin in the school orchestra and had started a tutoring program for elementary students. My parents, both college professors, had raised me to believe that education and character were the keys to success. "Maya," my mother would say while braiding my hair each morning, "you carry the dreams of generations on your shoulders, but never let that weight dim your light." The truth was, I carried more than dreams. I carried the expectations of an entire community that watched my family's every move. When I made honor roll, it reflected well on all Black students. When I won debate tournaments, I was representing more than just my school. There was no room for failure, no space for teenage mistakes or mediocrity. I had to be twice as good to get half as much recognition, and I had accepted that reality as the price of admission to spaces where I was often the only one who looked like me. But Millbrook had also given me gifts. I had developed an unshakable sense of self, an ability to stand alone when necessary, and a deep appreciation for allies who chose to see beyond skin color. My best friend Sarah, a white girl whose family had moved from California, became like a sister to me. She never asked to touch my hair or made comments about how articulate I was. Instead, she defended me when other kids made ignorant remarks and always made sure I was included in group activities. There was also Mrs. Patterson, my English teacher, who saw my potential and pushed me to apply for advanced writing workshops. Mr. Rodriguez, my chemistry teacher, who encouraged my interest in medicine and helped me secure internships at the local hospital. And Coach Williams, who made me debate team captain not because I was Black, but because I was the best debater on the team. These relationships had taught me that while racism existed, so did genuine human connection. They had shown me that my worth wasn't determined by my race, but by my character, intelligence, and contributions to my community. That Saturday in March started like any other. Spring was finally arriving in Ohio, and I had just finished my SAT prep class at the local community center. The class was small, just 8 students, including myself and Sarah. We were all college-bound seniors, stressed about acceptance letters and scholarship applications. I was feeling particularly confident that day because my practice scores had improved significantly, and I was finally hitting the targets I needed for my dream schools. I was feeling confident about my upcoming college applications, especially since I'd been accepted into a summer pre-med program at Ohio State University. The acceptance letter had arrived just 3 days earlier, and I was still riding the high of that achievement. My dream was to become a pediatric surgeon, and everything seemed to be falling into place. I had shadowed doctors at Millbrook General Hospital, volunteered in the children's ward, and maintained a 4.0 GPA while taking every AP science course my school offered. After SAT prep, Sarah had invited me to hang out at her house, but I wanted some alone time to process the morning's lessons and maybe get ahead on some homework. I decided to stop by Rosewood Cafe, the town's most popular hangout spot, to grab a celebratory smoothie and maybe do some studying. The cafe was known for its cozy atmosphere, local art on the walls, and the best acai bowls in 3 counties. It was where all the high school kids went after games, where families celebrated birthdays, and where the community gathered for fundraisers and events. I had discovered Rosewood Cafe during my freshman year, when Mom and I were exploring downtown Millbrook. It had become my go-to study spot, especially during exam periods. The owners had always been friendly, the Wi-Fi was reliable, and the background music was perfect for concentration. I had probably spent hundreds of hours there over the past 3 years, working on essays, preparing for debates, and meeting with study groups. The cafe held special memories for me, too. It's where I had celebrated making varsity debate team, where I had nervously opened my first college acceptance letter, and where I had written the personal statement that helped me secure my pre-med program acceptance. In many ways, it had become a second home, a neutral space where I could just be Maya the student, Maya the dreamer, not Maya the representative of her entire race. As I walked through the glass doors that Saturday, The familiar scent of coffee beans and fresh pastries welcomed me. The afternoon sun streamed through the large windows, casting warm patterns across the hardwood floors. I could see the corner table where I usually sat, right near the window with the best natural light. The local art on the walls had been rotated recently. There were new paintings from community members, including a beautiful landscape that captured the rolling hills outside town. I had been here dozens of times before, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. I knew the menu by heart and had even recommended the place to my parents' colleagues when they visited from out of town. The baristas usually recognized me and would sometimes start making my usual order before I even asked. But something felt different that day. Maybe it was the way conversations seemed to pause as I walked by, or how the usual friendly atmosphere felt somehow cooler. There were more people than usual for a Saturday afternoon, and I noticed several faces I didn't recognize. Some looked like college students, others like families visiting from neighboring towns. I chalked the strange feeling up to my imagination and made my way to the counter, my backpack slung over one shoulder, wearing my favorite sundress and the pearl earrings my grandmother had given me for my 16th birthday. I was dressed exactly as I always dressed, modestly, appropriately, like the well-raised young woman my parents had taught me to be. As I approached the counter, I pulled out my phone to review my notes from SAT prep while I waited in line. The questions we had practiced that morning were still fresh in my mind, and I wanted to review the strategies our instructor had shared for tackling the most challenging math problems. I was so focused on my studies that I almost didn't notice the shift in energy around me. The cafe was moderately busy for a Saturday afternoon. Families occupied the larger tables, teenagers clustered in the corner booths, and a few people worked alone on laptops. I recognized several faces. Mrs. Henderson from the library was reading a novel in the corner. The Martinez family was celebrating what looked like their daughter's birthday, and two of my classmates were studying together near the window. I took my place in line behind two other customers, pulling out my phone to review my notes from SAT prep while I waited. The line moved slowly, which was normal for Rosewood Cafe. They prided themselves on made-to-order drinks and took time to get each order perfect. I had always appreciated this attention to detail, even when it meant waiting a few extra minutes. The first customer, an older gentleman I didn't recognize, ordered a complicated coffee drink with multiple specifications. The cashier, a girl I now realized was Jessica from my school, took his order with patience and enthusiasm, asking clarifying questions and making suggestions. She smiled warmly as she explained the different milk alternatives and flavor options available. The second customer, a middle-aged woman, ordered for herself and her teenage daughter. Again, Jessica was attentive and friendly, even offering a loyalty card and explaining how the rewards program worked. The interaction was exactly what I had come to expect from Rosewood Cafe. Personalized service that made customers feel valued and welcome. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the counter with a smile, expecting the same warm service I had just witnessed. The cashier was Jessica Miller, a senior who I'd seen in the hallways but never really talked to. She was in my AP history class, though we sat on opposite sides of the room. She had blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun and wore the cafe's signature green apron over a black t-shirt. "Hi, Jessica," I said warmly, making sure to use her name since we went to school together. "Could I get a medium mango passion smoothie with extra protein powder, please?" Jessica looked at me with a blank expression, as if she hadn't heard me speak. Her eyes seemed to look right through me, focusing on something behind my head. She didn't acknowledge my greeting or make eye contact. Instead, she began wiping down the already spotless counter in front of her, moving slowly and deliberately. I stood there for a moment, confused. Maybe she really hadn't heard me over the background music, which seemed louder than usual, or perhaps she was distracted by something else. I had seen her be so attentive to the previous customers that I assumed she would extend the same courtesy to me. "Excuse me," I said, a little louder this time, my voice cutting through the ambient cafe noise. "I'd like to order a smoothie, please." Again, nothing. Jessica continued her cleaning routine, occasionally glancing past me toward the line that was beginning to form behind me. She picked up menus and straightened them, reorganized the tip jar, and adjusted the display of pastries, all while completely ignoring my presence. My cheeks started to burn with embarrassment as I realized that other customers were beginning to stare. I could feel the weight of their gazes, the shift in energy as people began to notice that something unusual was happening. The family celebrating the birthday had paused their conversation, and I saw the mother lean over to whisper something to her husband. Hello?" I tried once more, my voice slightly shaky now as confusion gave way to growing anxiety. "I'm ready to order." I even raised my hand slightly, thinking maybe there was some kind of visual barrier I wasn't aware of. But Jessica's eyes tracked my movement and then deliberately looked away, as if I was something unpleasant she was choosing to ignore. That's when Jessica did something that felt like a punch to my stomach. She looked directly over my head to the girl standing behind me, a white classmate named Brittany Walsh, and said cheerfully, "Next! What can I get for you today?" Her voice was bright and welcoming, the same tone she had used with the previous customers. It was as if a switch had been flipped, transforming her from the indifferent person who had been ignoring me into the friendly, customer service-oriented employee she was supposed to be. My mouth fell open. The entire cafe seemed to go silent around me, though I'm sure that was just my perception. The background music continued to play. The espresso machine continued to hiss, but all I could hear was the ringing in my ears and the sound of my own heartbeat. Brittany looked as shocked as I felt, her eyes wide as she glanced between Jessica and me with obvious discomfort. Brittany and I weren't close friends, but we had been in several classes together over the years. She knew who I was, knew I was a good student, knew I belonged in this space just as much as anyone else. "Oh, Brittany stammered, her voice uncertain and uncomfortable. "I think she was here first." She gestured toward me with an awkward movement of her hand. Jessica shrugged with an indifference that felt calculated and deliberate. Her expression didn't change, and her voice remained sickeningly sweet as she responded, "I didn't see anyone there," her words loud enough for nearby tables to hear clearly. "So what would you like?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I didn't see anyone there, as if I was invisible, as if I didn't exist, as if 17 years of life, dreams, achievements, and humanity could be erased by someone's refusal to acknowledge my presence. As if my honor roll certificates, my debate team victories, my volunteer work, my acceptance to pre-med programs, none of it mattered. In this moment, in this space, I simply didn't exist. My hands started to tremble, and I could feel the heat of embarrassment and anger rising in my chest like a tide I couldn't control. Around me, I became hyper-aware of every sound: the hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of cups, the murmur of conversations that seemed to have grown quieter as people began to realize something was wrong. The birthday celebration had stopped entirely, and I could see the parents trying to distract their young daughter from the unfolding drama. Several customers had definitely noticed what was happening, and I could feel their eyes on me like physical weight. Some looked away quickly when I glanced in their direction, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Others stared openly, as if I was providing entertainment for their afternoon coffee break. "Excuse me," I said, my voice stronger now despite the tremor in my hands. I straightened my shoulders and looked directly at Jessica, forcing her to acknowledge my presence. I was clearly standing here first. "I'd like to place my order." Jessica finally looked directly at me, and what I saw in her eyes made my heart sink. It wasn't confusion or misunderstanding. It wasn't distraction or busyness or any innocent explanation I might have hoped for. It was deliberate, cold dismissal. It was a look that said she knew exactly what she was doing, and she was enjoying it. "Look," she said with exaggerated patience, her voice dripping with condescension, as if she was speaking to a child who couldn't understand simple instructions. "I'm trying to serve actual customers here. If you're not going to order anything, you need to move along." The words were like a slap across my face. Actual customers. The implication was crystal clear. In her mind, I didn't qualify as a real customer. Not in this place, not in this town, not in this world that suddenly felt much smaller and more hostile than it had when I'd walked through the door 15 minutes earlier. Despite my money, despite my history with this establishment, despite my place in this community, I was somehow less than worthy of service, less than deserving of basic human decency, less than human. Behind me, I heard someone whisper, "That's not right." The voice sounded like it might have been an older woman, but when I glanced back, I couldn't identify who had spoken. But no one spoke up louder. No one intervened. No one stood up and said what everyone could clearly see, that this was discrimination, pure and simple. I was standing in a room full of people, some of whom I'd known for years, some of whom had watched me grow up in this community, and I had never felt more alone. The isolation was suffocating, as if I was trapped in a glass box where everyone could see me but no one could hear my voice or feel my pain. My mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe Jessica was having a bad day. Maybe there was some misunderstanding. Maybe I had unknowingly done something to offend her. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't about my behavior or her mood or any complex interpersonal dynamic. This was about the color of my skin, plain and simple. This was about someone deciding that I didn't belong in a space I had considered safe, welcoming, and mine. The rational part of my brain told me to walk away, to preserve my dignity, to find somewhere else to spend my money. But something deeper, something connected to every person who had faced this kind of treatment before me, told me to stand my ground. I thought about my grandmother, who had lived through Jim Crow and had told me stories about lunch counters and water fountains and all the places she had been told she didn't belong. I thought about my parents, who had fought to build a life in this community. I thought about the little black girls who might face this same treatment someday, and what it would mean if I walked away without saying anything. "I have money," I said, reaching for my wallet with hands that I willed to stay steady. My voice was clear and strong, carrying across the now quiet cafe. "I've been coming here for years. I know exactly what I want to order. There's no reason you can't serve me." I pulled out a $20 bill and placed it on the counter, the crisp green paper stark against the dark wood surface. "I'd like a medium mango passion smoothie with extra protein powder. That's $11.50, plus tax." Jessica looked at the money as if it was contaminated, then back at me with an expression that had moved from indifference to outright hostility. She crossed her arms and leaned back against the espresso machine, her body language screaming defiance and disdain. "I reserve the right to refuse service to anyone," she said, her voice carrying a smugness that made my stomach turn. She gestured toward a small sign posted near the register, one I had never noticed before in my years of coming to this establishment. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." Somewhere else. The words echoed in my mind, carrying with them the weight of generations of discrimination. How many times had my grandparents heard those words? How many times had my parents? How many times had Black families been told to find somewhere else to eat, somewhere else to shop, somewhere else to exist? And now, in 2024, in a place I'd considered a second home, I was hearing them too. Brittany had stepped aside, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but unsure how to help. She kept looking between Jessica and me, her face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. I could see in her eyes that she knew this was wrong, but she didn't know how to fix it. The line behind her was growing longer, and I could feel the impatience of other customers mixing with their curiosity about the unfolding drama. "This is discrimination," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the cafe. The word hung in the air like a bomb that no one knew how to defuse. "You're refusing to serve me because I'm Black." A collective intake of breath rippled through the cafe. Some customers looked away quickly, as if acknowledging what was happening would make them complicit. Others leaned forward, suddenly more interested in the confrontation. The family celebrating the birthday hurriedly gathered their things and left, the parents ushering their young daughter out before she could witness any more of the ugliness unfolding at the counter. Jessica's face hardened at my accusation. "I'm not discriminating against anyone," she said loudly, playing to the audience that had gathered. "I'm just doing my job. Not my fault if some people don't know how to behave in public." The accusation that I didn't know how to behave was perhaps the most insulting part of all. I was dressed nicely in a modest sundress and cardigan, speaking politely, and trying to order a simple smoothie with my own money. My voice hadn't been raised, I hadn't used any inappropriate language, and I hadn't done anything except exist in a space where someone had decided I didn't belong. What about my behavior warranted this treatment? What had I done except exist as a Black teenager in a predominantly white space? What rules of public behavior had I violated by standing in line, speaking respectfully, and attempting to make a purchase? I looked around the cafe, hoping to see a manager or another employee who might intervene. The other barista, a young man whose name I didn't know, was conspicuously absent from behind the counter. Several customers were watching now, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable to sympathetic to carefully neutral. An older white woman at a nearby table shook her head disapprovingly, but I couldn't tell if her disapproval was directed at Jessica's behavior or at me for causing a scene. Two women who looked like they might be teachers were whispering to each other, occasionally glancing in my direction. A man in a business suit was typing furiously on his phone, and I wondered if he was documenting what was happening or simply trying to ignore it. Two teenage boys from my school were sitting in a corner booth, and I saw one of them pull out his phone. My heart sank as I realized he might be recording this humiliation. The thought of this moment being shared on social media, of becoming a viral video of discrimination, made me feel sick. I imagined the comments, the debates, the way this moment of my life would be reduced to content for other people's entertainment. But then I thought about something else. If he was recording, maybe that was good. Maybe this needed to be documented. Maybe people needed to see that this kind of discrimination still happened, even in 2024, even in liberal college towns, even to well-dressed, well-spoken teenagers who had done nothing wrong. "I have money," I said again, my voice growing stronger as my anger began to outweigh my shock. "I've been coming here for years. I know exactly what I want to order. There's no reason you can't serve me except for the color of my skin." I thought about my parents, who had worked so hard to build a life in this community. They had faced their own share of discrimination, the colleagues who questioned their qualifications, the neighbors who were slow to warm up to them, the constant need to prove themselves in ways their white counterparts never had to. But they had persevered, believing that their children would inherit a better world. I thought about my mother's advice to always take the high road, to be twice as good to get half as much. I thought about my father's warnings about how to behave in situations like this. Stay calm. Don't give them any reason to call you aggressive or threatening. Document everything. And remember that your dignity is more important than any confrontation. I thought about my dreams of medical school, of helping children, of making a difference in the world. Was this what I would face everywhere I went? Would I have to prove my worthiness to exist in spaces that others took for granted? Would there always be people who looked at me and saw a threat, a problem, an unwelcome intruder? The rational part of my mind told me to walk away, to leave with my dignity intact, to find somewhere else to spend my money. There were other cafes in town, other places where I could study and relax. Why should I subject myself to this humiliation? Why should I give this person the satisfaction of ruining my day? But something deeper, something connected to every person who had faced this kind of treatment before me, told me to stand my ground. This wasn't just about a smoothie or even about my personal dignity. This was about the principle that I belonged in any public space I chose to enter. This was about refusing to be erased, ignored, or dismissed. "I'm not leaving," I said clearly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I'm a paying customer, and I have every right to be served here." Jessica's expression grew even more hostile. She looked around the cafe as if seeking support from the other customers or employees. When none came, she picked up the phone near the register and held it up threateningly. "Fine," she said, her voice dripping with false authority. "Maybe I should call the police to remove a disruptive customer." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Call the police for trying to buy a smoothie, for standing my ground, for existing while black in a space where someone had decided I didn't belong. The implications were terrifying. I thought about all the news stories I had heard, all the videos I had seen of black people being arrested, harassed, or worse for doing normal, everyday activities. Getting coffee, studying in a library, sleeping in a dorm, existing in spaces where someone else decided they didn't belong. My heart began to race as I realized how quickly this situation could escalate. What if the police came? What if they believed Jessica's version of events instead of mine? What if my parents had to come pick me up from jail? What if this incident appeared on my permanent record and affected my college applications? But then I thought about something else. I thought about all the times my parents had taught me about civil rights history, about the young people who had sat at lunch counters and ridden buses and walked across bridges despite threats and violence. They had faced much worse than what I was experiencing now, and they had refused to back down. I thought about my grandmother, who had told me stories about being denied service at restaurants and stores throughout the South. She had always ended those stories with the same message. "Baby, we didn't fight so hard for you to accept being treated as less than. You stand up for yourself? You hear me?" The cafe had grown unnaturally quiet. Even the background music seemed muted. Every customer was watching now, waiting to see what would happen next. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared uncomfortable, and a few seemed to be enjoying the drama. But they were all watching, all bearing witness to this moment. I could feel the weight of their gazes, the pressure of being the only black person in a room full of white faces, all of them judging my reaction to discrimination. If I got angry, I would be labeled as aggressive. If I walked away, I would be seen as weak. If I stood my ground, I would be called disruptive. There was no winning move in this situation, no response that wouldn't be criticized or misinterpreted. But I also realized something important. This wasn't about them. This wasn't about performing the right kind of reaction for their comfort. This was about my own dignity, my own sense of self-worth, my own refusal to accept treatment that was clearly wrong. "Go ahead and call them," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "Call the police and tell them you're discriminating against a customer because of her race. I'm sure they'll be very interested in that conversation." Jessica's hand hesitated over the phone. For the first time since this confrontation began, she looked uncertain. Maybe she was realizing that her actions had witnesses, that her discrimination had been both blatant and public. Maybe she was beginning to understand that calling the police might not go the way she expected. The tension in the cafe was thick enough to cut when I heard footsteps approaching from the back of the store. Everyone turned to look as a tall, older black man emerged from what I assumed was the office or storage area. He was well dressed in a navy button-down shirt and khakis, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He moved with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being in charge. My heart stopped. In all my years of coming to Rosewood Cafe, I had never seen this man before. But there was something about the way he carried himself, the way other employees straightened up when they saw him, that suggested he wasn't just another worker. As he approached the counter, I realized with a shock that sent my head spinning. This was the owner. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority that immediately commanded attention from everyone in the cafe. Jessica's demeanor changed instantly. Her smugness evaporated, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. She quickly set down the phone she had been threatening to use and straightened her posture, suddenly looking like the teenager she was rather than the authority figure she had been pretending to be. "Oh, Mr. Washington, there was a situation with a difficult customer." Her voice trailed off as she gestured vaguely in my direction, clearly hoping he would take her side without asking too many questions. Mr. Washington's eyes moved from Jessica to me, and I saw something flash across his face. Recognition, understanding, and what looked like deep disappointment mixed with a familiar pain. It was the expression of someone who had hoped the world had changed more than it actually had. Someone who recognized the scene playing out in front of him because he had lived it himself. He walked around the counter with deliberate steps, his presence immediately changing the energy in the room. As he approached me directly, I could see that his kind eyes held decades of experience, wisdom earned through struggles I could only imagine. "Miss, I'm Robert Washington, and I own this establishment," he said, extending his hand to me with a warmth that was the complete opposite of the coldness I had just experienced. "I'm terribly sorry for whatever has happened here. Would you mind telling me your side of the story?" My mind was reeling. The owner was black. The owner was standing right here witnessing the discrimination that his employee had just directed at me. In all my years of coming to this cafe, I had never seen him before. I had assumed, like most people probably did, that the owner was white. The cafe was in a predominantly white town, served a predominantly white clientele, and employed what appeared to be predominantly white staff. But here he was, a successful black businessman who had built something beautiful in this community, and his own employee had just discriminated against a black customer right under his roof. I shook his hand, trying to process this unexpected turn of events, while also grappling with the emotional whiplash of the past 20 minutes. I just wanted to order a smoothie, I said, my voice still shaky from the adrenaline but growing stronger as I realized I finally had someone who would listen to me. I've been coming here for years. I'm Maya Johnson. I go to Millbrook High. But I gestured toward Jessica, who now looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. She ignored me, then told the girl behind me that she didn't see anyone there. She said I wasn't an actual customer and threatened to call the police. As I spoke, I watched Mr. Washington's expression carefully. I saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, saw the way his hands clenched slightly at his sides, saw the flash of anger that he was working hard to control. But more than anger, I saw pain. The deep, soul-weary pain of someone who had hoped his success would shield the next generation from the discrimination he had faced. Mr. Washington turned to address the cafe at large, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent space. Every conversation had stopped. Every customer was listening. Even the background music seemed to have been turned down. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to apologize for the disruption to your afternoon," he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that suggested barely controlled emotion. "What you've witnessed here is completely unacceptable and goes against everything this establishment stands for." He looked directly at Jessica, who had gone pale and was gripping the edge of the counter as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Jessica, please step into my office immediately." "But Mr. Washington, I was just—" she started, her voice high and desperate. "Now," he said firmly, the single word carrying enough authority to end any argument. As Jessica hurried toward the back of the cafe, practically running in her eagerness to escape the situation she had created, Mr. Washington turned back to me. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable. The authority was still there, but it was tempered with gentleness and genuine care. "Young lady, I am profoundly sorry for the treatment you received here today," he said, and I could hear the sincerity in every word. "This is not who we are, and it's not what we stand for. I opened this cafe to be a welcoming space for everyone in our community, regardless of race, religion, or background." He paused, seeming to collect his thoughts while also appearing to wrestle with emotions that ran much deeper than this single incident. When he continued, his voice carried the weight of personal experience and hard-won wisdom. "You know, I bought this building 15 years ago, right after I retired from teaching high school chemistry," he said, and I could see him making the deliberate choice to share his story, not just with me, but with everyone in the cafe who was listening. "I'd saved for 20 years to make this dream happen. I wanted to create a place where young people like yourself could feel safe, welcomed, and valued." The irony wasn't lost on me, or anyone else in the cafe. Here was a black business owner who had worked his entire life to create inclusive spaces, who had probably faced countless instances of discrimination himself, only to have his own employee perpetrate the exact kind of treatment he had fought against. The weight of that irony settled over the room like a heavy blanket. "I understand if you never want to come back here," Mr. Washington continued, his voice gentle but carrying an underlying strength. "But I hope you'll give me a chance to make this right. Your smoothie is on the house today, and I'd like to personally ensure you're treated with the respect and dignity you deserve. I looked around the cafe, seeing the faces of my classmates and community members who had witnessed this entire exchange. Some looked ashamed, clearly recognizing that they had remained silent when they should have spoken up. Others appeared moved by Mr. Washington's response, nodding approvingly at his words and his actions. The two women who looked like teachers were now openly supportive, one of them giving me an encouraging smile. The teenage boy who had been recording put his phone away, and I noticed several people nodding approvingly at the owner's words. Even the man in the business suit had stopped typing and was watching the interaction with what appeared to be respect for how Mr. Washington was handling the situation. "Thank you," I managed to say, feeling tears prick at my eyes for the first time since this ordeal began. I appreciate your response more than you know." But these weren't tears of sadness or humiliation anymore. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of connection to something larger than myself. Here was someone who understood, someone who had faced his own struggles and had chosen to respond with grace and strength. Mr. Washington smiled, and in that smile I saw decades of his own struggles, his own dreams deferred and achieved, and his determination to make things better for the next generation. There was something almost paternal in his expression, as if he saw in me a younger version of himself, or perhaps the children he had taught throughout his career. "What's your name, young lady?" he asked. "Maya Johnson," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded now. "Maya, it's an honor to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances," he said with genuine warmth. Maya is a beautiful name. It means illusion in Sanskrit. But I suspect there's nothing illusory about your strength and character. The fact that he knew the meaning of my name, that he took the time to acknowledge it rather than just moving on to business, showed me the kind of person he was. This was someone who saw people as individuals, who valued human connection, who understood that dignity was found in the details. "What would you like to drink today?" he asked, moving behind the counter with practiced ease. As Mr. Washington personally prepared my mango passion smoothie, he continued talking, and I realized he was addressing not just me, but everyone in the cafe who was listening. "You know, Maya, I grew up in Alabama in the 1960s, he said while adding the protein powder to my smoothie. "My grandmother used to tell me about the lunch counter sit-ins, about young people not much older than you who refused to accept that they didn't belong in certain spaces. They faced much worse than what you experienced today, but the principle is the same. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity." He handed me the smoothie, which was perfectly made. "When I see young people like you standing up for yourselves with grace and strength, it gives me hope. It tells me that their sacrifices weren't in vain." I took a sip of the smoothie, and it was delicious. But more than that, it represented something powerful. It represented ownership, dignity, and the full circle of progress. Here was a man who had probably faced discrimination his entire life, who had worked and saved and dreamed until he could create a space where that discrimination couldn't touch him or anyone else. "I don't usually share personal stories with customers," Mr. Washington continued, "but something about today feels important. When I was about your age, I was kicked out of a soda fountain in Birmingham for trying to order a Coca-Cola. The owner called me names I won't repeat and threatened to have me arrested." The cafe was completely silent now, everyone hanging on his words. I promised myself that day that if I ever had the opportunity, I would create a space where no young person would ever experience what I experienced. Today, I failed in that promise, and for that, I am deeply sorry. I felt tears pricking at my eyes But they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of recognition, of understanding, of connection to something larger than myself. "Mr. Washington," I said, "you didn't fail. What happened today wasn't your fault, but your response, the way you handled it, that's everything. That's how change happens." He smiled at me, and I saw pride in his eyes. "You handled yourself with remarkable grace under very difficult circumstances, Maya. Your parents should be proud." By this time, other customers had begun approaching. Brittany, the girl who had been behind me in line, came over first. "Maya, I'm so sorry about what happened," she said genuinely. "That was completely wrong, and I should have spoken up louder." "Thank you for trying to help," I replied. "It meant more than you know." Several other customers approached to apologize for not intervening, to express their disgust with Jessica's behavior, and to thank Mr. Washington for his leadership. I realized that what had started as an experience of isolation and discrimination had become something else entirely: a teaching moment, a community conversation, and a demonstration of what leadership looks like in the face of injustice. The older woman who had been shaking her head earlier came over and surprised me by saying, "Young lady, I've lived in this town for 60 years, and what that girl did to you was shameful. You showed more class and dignity than she deserved." Even the teenage boys from my school approached, looking sheepish. "Hey, Maya," one of them said. "We're sorry we didn't say anything. That was messed up." As I prepared to leave the cafe, Mr. Washington walked me to the door, just as he had done for other customers throughout the afternoon. But this felt different, more personal, more significant. He paused at the entrance, looking out at the busy street beyond the cafe windows, where life was continuing as normal, unaware of the profound moment that had just unfolded inside. "Maya," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience and hard-won wisdom, "I want you to know that what happened here today says nothing about your worth and everything about the work we still have to do as a community." He paused, and I could see him choosing his words carefully, understanding that this moment would stay with me for the rest of my life. "But I also want you to remember this. You stood your ground. You demanded to be treated with dignity. You didn't let someone else's prejudice make you question your right to exist in any space you choose to enter." I nodded, feeling the weight and power of his words settling into my heart. These weren't just platitudes or empty encouragement. They were truths that I had learned through experience, lessons that had been written into my soul through struggle. "And one more thing," he continued, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder in a gesture that felt both paternal and empowering. "I meant what I said about this being a safe space. I hope you'll come back, not because you have to prove anything to anyone, but because this is your community too, and you belong here." As I walked out of Rosewood Cafe that day, my smoothie consumed and my homework completed, I realized that everything had changed. Not just my relationship with this particular space, but my understanding of myself and my place in the world. I had faced discrimination, real, ugly, deliberate discrimination, and I had survived it. More than that, I had found my voice and used it to demand the respect I deserved. That evening, I sat at our kitchen table while my mother prepared dinner, trying to find the words to explain what had happened. The familiar sounds of home, the sizzle of onions in the pan, the classical music playing softly from the radio, the rustle of papers as my father graded assignments, created a cocoon of safety around me as I processed the day's events. "Mama," I said finally, "something happened today at the cafe." She turned from the stove, immediately reading something serious in my tone. My father looked up from his stack of papers, and I could see both of them shifting into the alert, protective mode that Black parents know all too well. I told them everything. About Jessica's deliberate dismissal, about the humiliation of being ignored and erased, about the threat to call the police, about Mr. Washington's intervention and the community's response. As I spoke, I watched my mother's face cycle through a range of emotions: anger, pain, pride, and finally, a deep sadness that spoke to her own experiences with discrimination. When I finished, my mother came over and took my hands in hers, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Maya," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you handled that situation with more grace and strength than many adults would have shown. You are exactly who I raised you to be." She paused, and I could see her wrestling with the dual emotions that Black parents carry: pride in their children's strength and sorrow that such strength is necessary. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself," she continued, "but I'm also heartbroken that you had to. In 2024, in a community where we've built a life, where we thought you were safe, it's devastating to know that our daughter still faces this kind of treatment." My father, usually a man of few words, came over and put his arms around both of us. "Your grandmother would have been proud," he said simply, and those 5 words carried more weight than any lengthy speech could have. Over the following days and weeks, word spread through our small town about the incident at Rosewood Cafe. The story took on a life of its own, growing and changing as it passed from person to person. Some people focused on Jessica's termination, others on Mr. Washington's response, and still others on the broader questions about race and inclusion in our community. I heard through the grapevine that Jessica's family was upset about her firing, claiming she had been treated unfairly. Some people agreed with them, arguing that teenagers make mistakes and shouldn't have their futures ruined by one moment of poor judgment. Others felt that her behavior had been so clearly discriminatory that termination was the only appropriate response. The incident sparked conversations that our community had been avoiding for years. At school, teachers began incorporating discussions about bias and discrimination into their lessons. The local newspaper ran a series of articles about race relations in small-town America. Community groups organized forums for dialogue and understanding. Mr. Washington was true to his word about implementing changes at the cafe. He brought in diversity training consultants to work with his staff, created clear policies about discrimination and inclusion, and established regular community dialogues about race and social justice. Most importantly, he used his position as a respected business owner to advocate for broader changes in how our town approached issues of equity and inclusion. I continued to frequent Rosewood Cafe, and each time I went, I was greeted with warmth and respect. Mr. Washington would always ask about my studies, my college applications, and my dreams of becoming a doctor. Sometimes we would talk about the challenges of being Black in predominantly white spaces, and he would share wisdom from his decades of experience navigating similar terrain. The new employees he hired were more diverse, and I noticed that the training they received was more comprehensive than what Jessica had apparently gotten. More importantly, the culture of the cafe shifted. It became a place where inclusion wasn't just a policy, but a lived value, where differences were celebrated rather than merely tolerated. 3 months after the incident, I received a letter in the mail that I wasn't expecting. It was from Jessica. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, as if each word had been chosen with great thought. "Dear Maya," it began, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I needed to write to you and try to explain. What I did that day was wrong, and I've spent every day since trying to understand why I acted the way I did. The letter went on for several pages, detailing her own journey of self-reflection and education since losing her job. She wrote about the conversations she'd had with her family, the books she'd been reading, the volunteer work she'd started doing with community organizations focused on racial justice. She didn't make excuses for her behavior, but she tried to provide context for the ignorance and prejudice that had shaped her worldview. "I know this doesn't change what happened," she wrote, "and I know it doesn't undo the pain I caused you. But I want you to know that your courage in standing up to me that day changed my life. It forced me to confront parts of myself that I didn't even know existed. I'm not the same person I was 3 months ago, and I have you to thank for that." I read the letter several times, feeling a complex mix of emotions. I was surprised by her thoughtfulness and vulnerability, touched by her willingness to take responsibility, and hopeful about her commitment to growth. But I was also wary, knowing that real change takes time and consistent action, not just good intentions and well-written letters. I showed the letter to my parents and to Mr. Washington, seeking their perspectives on how to respond. My mother encouraged me to write back, saying that grace and forgiveness were powerful tools for healing. My father was more skeptical, warning me to be cautious about people who claimed to have sudden conversions after facing consequences for their actions. Mr. Washington encouraged me to trust my instincts and do whatever felt right for me. In the end, I decided to write a brief response. I thanked Jessica for her letter, acknowledged her efforts to grow and learn, but also made it clear that forgiveness was a process, not a single moment. I told her that I hoped she would continue her journey of education and that she would use her experience to help others avoid making the same mistakes. The day I received my acceptance letter to pre-med at Ohio State, the first place I went to celebrate was Rosewood Cafe. Mr. Washington personally made my smoothie and refused to let me pay for it, just as he had done several times over the previous months. "This one's on me," he said with a grin that lit up his entire face. From one barrier breaker to another. We talked for nearly an hour about my plans for college, my goals for medical school, and my dreams of becoming a pediatric surgeon. He shared stories about his own daughter, who was now a successful lawyer in Chicago, and his pride in seeing young people like me pursue their dreams despite the obstacles they faced. "You know, Maya," he said as our conversation wound down, "what happened here that day in March was terrible. But the way you handled it, the way our community responded, the changes we've made, that's given me more hope for the future than I've felt in years." As I prepared to graduate high school and head off to college, I reflected often on that March afternoon that had changed my understanding of myself and my place in the world. I realized that discrimination hadn't broken me. It had revealed the strength I already possessed. It had shown me that my worth isn't determined by others' inability to see my value. The experience taught me that standing up for yourself doesn't always lead to immediate vindication, but it always leads to self-respect. I learned that allies come in unexpected forms, and that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is the demonstration of love and dignity. I discovered that one person's courage to do the right thing can change the entire dynamic of a situation, and that leadership in the face of injustice can inspire others to examine their own beliefs and behaviors. Most importantly, I learned that I am not responsible for changing people's hearts, but I am responsible for refusing to let their prejudice diminish my light. I cannot control what others think about me because of my race, but I can control how I respond to their ignorance. I can choose to stand tall, speak with dignity, and refuse to internalize their limitations as my own. As I packed for college that summer, I carefully folded the sundress I had worn that day at the cafe. It had become a symbol for me, not of the discrimination I had faced, but of the strength I had discovered. Looking at it reminded me that I had walked into that cafe as a girl and walked out as a young woman who knew her worth. The pearls from my grandmother went into my jewelry box with extra care. They had been with me during one of the most challenging moments of my young life, and they would be with me as I faced new challenges in college and beyond. They connected me to a legacy of strong women who had faced far greater obstacles than anything I would ever encounter. Today, as I prepare to start my journey toward becoming a pediatric surgeon, I carry that lesson with me. I know that I will face more discrimination in my life, in college, in medical school, in my career. The medical field, like many professional spaces, still struggles with issues of diversity and inclusion. I will likely encounter professors who doubt my abilities, classmates who question my presence, and colleagues who see my success as taking something away from them. But I also know that I have the strength to face whatever comes. I know how to stand my ground with dignity, how to demand respect without compromising my values, and how to turn moments of discrimination into opportunities for education and growth. I know that my worth is not determined by others' prejudices, and that my dreams are valid regardless of who believes in them. The smoothie that day was delicious, but the lesson was even sweeter. I belong in every space I choose to enter, and I will never again let anyone convince me otherwise. When people look at me now, they don't just see a young black woman. They see a future doctor, a leader, a voice for change. They see someone who refused to be made invisible, who demanded to be seen and heard and valued. Because that's who I've always been. That's who I was raised to be. And that's who I will continue to be, no matter who tries to tell me otherwise. The incident at Rosewood Cafe could have been just another story of discrimination, another example of how far we still have to go as a society. But because of Mr. Washington's leadership, because of the community's willingness to engage in difficult conversations, and because of my own refusal to accept treatment that was beneath my dignity, it became something more. It became a catalyst for change, a teachable moment, and a reminder that progress happens one person, one interaction, one moment of courage at a time. They judged me by my skin color that day at Rosewood Cafe, but I showed them, and more importantly, I showed myself, the unshakable strength of my soul. And that, I've learned, is a power that no one can ever take away from me.